I'm Janet Cassidy. I'm a member of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, and I'm also a member of the Clydebank Trade Council that have called this meeting. I'll introduce the speakers. I'll start from the left. We've got Gail Patterson, which I'm sure a lot of you know, an SNP. Nigel Griffiths, who is the former Deputy Leader of the House of Commons and the Scottish Organiser of Labour Leave. On my right, Gail Casey, who is a local MSP, councillor, sorry, who's standing for MSP. That's right. You get it tongue-tied. And Alex Smith, who is a former Labour MEP. So what we're going to do is have one for staying. So Gail's going to kick us off, and then Nigel will take it for leaving, and then we'll go back to Gail and then Alex.
Chair. I'm Gail Casey, and I've been a local councillor in Western Berkshire now for 13 years, representing my community here in Clydebank. I'm the local Scottish Labour candidate for the Scottish Parliament. I'm working hard for the opportunity to improve the lives of people here in Clydebank. I want to thank Tommy and the Trades Council for inviting me to participate in the European debate here today, and I'm sure we'll all learn something that we didn't know before. Over the past few years, I've given the issue of the EU very serious consideration, listening to the media reports about whether Britain should vote to stay or leave the European Union. My initial instinct was to remain in Europe, and I continue to believe that that is what is best for my family and the wider community in Scotland. As a young woman growing up in the 70s and the 80s, I took full advantage of the opportunities following the 1975 EU referendum to work and travel freely in Europe. I found it much simpler to find employment and be accepted within the EU countries at that time. Since then, I have watched the EU develop into a 28-nation bloc, taking democracy and workers' rights to countries like Greece and Spain. For me, jobs and investment play a key factor in my decision to stay in the EU. As a long-time Labour Party member and an active trade unionist, it was very satisfying for me in 1997 to watch Labour take power in the UK, and that same year we joined the social chapter in Europe, which provided protection in the workplace for UK workers, giving them decent basic minimum standards. The right to 4 weeks paid leave, rights for part-time workers, paid maternity and paternity leave, anti-discrimination laws and protection when companies changed ownership under TUC. All hard-won rights that make a daily difference to the people in the UK. Britain has free access to the EU single market, consisting of 550 million consumers. It's the largest commercial market in the world, bigger even than the USA. Statistics show that Europe is currently buying half of all British exports, and 8 out of 10 of our top export markets are in Europe. All that trade and all those exports keep people in work. For us in the UK, it translates into jobs and in turn puts a reliance on Britain to play its part in Europe. 2/3 of all manufacturing jobs in Britain are dependent on demand from Europe. And let's not forget, we also have several million people, British people, living and working in Europe. Another important issue for me is immigration and free travel in Europe. As I highlighted earlier, I greatly benefited from being able to work and travel freely. I made many friends, learned about different traditions and cultures. I learned how to have an open outward view of the world, and I would like all our young people to have the same opportunities. Every generation faces challenges over how to manage and control migration and immigration, how to maximise on the benefits bringing new talent can bring, people with skills meeting shortfalls in the workforce while managing and coping with the pace of change. Over the last few years, immigration has continued to increase. The TV pictures of people putting their lives in danger, trying to cross to Europe in flimsy boats is very disturbing. Also, migrants trying illegally to get across the Channel to the UK. Most of this unplanned mass movement of people is emanating from the crisis in Syria. The wider displacement that is going on in Syria, Turkey and Greece, etc., should be dealt with by the EU member states acting together, and the UK should play its part in that. As a humanitarian, I would be arguing strongly for the UK to be involved in tackling the refugee crisis. This issue is more likely to be resolved by strong and coordinated action from the 28 nation states of the EU, rather than the unorganised response we actually witnessed. Here in the UK, we need to understand the difference between those travelling and working freely in Europe and the other types of immigration and refugees, many caused by war and persecution. We need to look at a border control system that is fair and properly enforced. The other major influence in my decision to stay in Europe is security. There have been a number of recent atrocities in Belgium, Paris, Madrid and London, which highlight that terrorism can happen anywhere. We in Glasgow know that only too well with the attack on Glasgow Airport and further back the Lockerbie tragedy. We hear about the threat levels and about the planned strategies to deal with it, so steps are actually being taken to protect us. We have had peace for 70 years in Western Europe, and the new member nations clearly don't want the ethnic and political wars that have blighted their countries. I believe being part of the EU and being able to access all its security resources and technologies is essential, and I am grateful for this level of security. I'm sure that many of you would agree that Brussels creates too much bureaucracy. Pope Francis, in his address to the EU Parliament back in November 2014, said that philosophy and great ideas of the EU have been stifled by bureaucrats and technocrats. He told the EU Parliament that there was a growing mistrust on the part of its citizens towards the EU institutions, considering them to be aloof, insensitive and out of touch. I do agree the EU is a far from perfect institution. Its flaws are not insurmountable, though, and it's clear that many countries are willing to join and see the logic of membership. For me, the great ideas that once inspired Europe can have an action again. Changes can be made to the institutions. In fact, work is well underway on this matter with what they call a refit programme. Amid all the clumsy bureaucracy and failings, the EU has provided peace, jobs, living standards and a better quality of life for people across the continent of Europe. So for me, the only choice is that we remain within Europe and try and work with the 28 countries therein. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. What I thought I'd maybe do is, we've heard from Gail, we'll hear from Nigel, and then if there's questions for those two, and then if it's okay, then we'll switch over to Gail and Alex, if that's okay. Nigel, the floor is yours.
Yes, Janet, thank you very much. Let me first of all thank Janet, Tommy and the Trades Council for organising this event, and I also want to thank John Foster and my colleagues and comrades on Scottish Labour Leave who have been at the forefront of the campaign here in Scotland. This referendum is very much about the future of our country and our ability to take decisions on behalf of ourselves, of our two parliaments to be able to democratically enact what they're voted to do, and of our courts to respond to that too. And the stark facts are this, that every day we hand over to Brussels £50 million, every week £350 million, every year £19 billion goes from our taxes, our treasury, to Brussels. We get less than half of that back, and what we do get back, we are dictated on how we spend it. We can't spend it on what we want. And if you take something like structural funds, where of the 19 billion that we hand over to Brussels, we get about 1.4 billion only back. And that again is dictated how we spend that very small sum of money on trying to revitalise some of the infrastructure that is critical to our country. And here in Clydebank, I don't need to elaborate on that much further. And for 19 years, the accounts that have been submitted by Brussels have not been fully approved by accountants. And why is that? Well, as recently as January, the EU accounts were exposed for spending, or wasting rather, over £11 billion on overseas aid. Not 11 million, £11 billion on overseas aid, which the own internal document of the EU said had been wasted through either corruption or just simple inefficiency. And then there's the £1.4 billion that was illegally used, according to the World Trade Organization, to prop up rich farmers in Europe and export sugar as a subsidy to bankrupt farmers in Africa. So there's an immorality about the policy there as well. And my final point on the taxation and spending issue is the Tax Dodgers Charter that was crafted in Luxembourg, that has allowed Starbucks, McDonald's, Google and others to relocate where they spend their tax to the lowest spending part, and that is Luxembourg, while making most of their money that they make in Europe here in the United Kingdom. And who was the architect of that Luxembourg policy? None other than the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who is now the President of the European Council, Jean-Claude Juncker. We have no powers, our courts have no powers to decide that Starbucks and those other companies spend and contribute fair taxes here. We're subject to their handouts and their goodwill, because they are protected not just by the EU, but by the European Court as well. And if we look at the issue that's been touched on of workers' rights, no one should be in any doubt that it was in 1997 that a Labour government put in its election manifesto the rights of part-time workers and all workers to holiday pay, to pension contributions, to sick pay and paid sick leave. These were something that were opposed by many other political parties in this country and would not have been enacted without Labour enacting them. In fact, the safeguard we've got now is the fact that they are so popular with the public that not even the most toxic Tories want to reverse them. We don't need any protection from Europe on that. In fact, we fear the EU, because if you look at what's happened with the bailout of the euro and those poor countries, Portugal, Greece, Romania, even Ireland, Southern Ireland, the effect it's had on them, it's been terrible on workers' rights. It's the EU that led the charge to ensure that 0 hours contracts were enforced on Greek workers. It's the EU that led the charge that ensured that in Ireland they tore up free collective bargaining, imposed a 20% cut on the workers' pay levels there. That is the threat that comes to the workers, and anybody who believes that the EU is a safeguard for workers is living in the past, I'm afraid. And if we look at the future under TTIP, where a Labour or other government may want to take back the privatised contracts in the health service or the privatised contracts on the railways, no, TTIP steps in, and where those companies are multinationals like the Americans, they can actually challenge that in the British courts and seek compensation for losing those contracts. And even if we're told TTIP won't get through, and I fear very much that it will, if you look at what's going to happen to the railways, the EU has already agreed that by 2019, every railway in Europe shall be subject to competitive tendering. And that will be disastrous too, especially since I believe that the place of railways in Britain in a future Labour manifesto should be in the public sector. And if we look at security, which again has been mentioned, well, I'm afraid the arguments that we are secure within the EU were blown out the water by the recently retired head of MI5, Sir Richard Dearlove, who said earlier this week that the protection and reporting policies in the EU are a shambles. It leaks like a sieve when we share security information, he said. We would be better off out of the EU and deciding which information we share, because the quality of our information is far greater. And in terms of cooperation when we leave, he said, they all want to share our security information on people, on terrorism, on ISIS, because it is of a far higher quality than theirs. And he said there is no reason under certain circumstances why we shouldn't do that sharing. Let's look at what's happened in the NHS in the EU. Under the Clinical Trials Directive, it has been a disaster as the large pharmaceutical companies have dictated the terms of that directive to drive out smaller, more flexible competitors. If you listen to Professor Maurice Brown of Cambridge University, the Professor of Clinical Oncology there, he said that the cost of clinical trials in the NHS has now skyrocketed so much that it's putting patients' lives at risk. If you listen to Professor Angus Dalgleish, who's the Professor of Clinical Pharmacology at Queen Margaret's in London, he specifically said that trials that were costing him £200,000 to run before the directive now cost £2 million plus. And that is the subject. That is because, obviously, the smaller companies can't afford the Brussels lobbyists, but the large pharmaceuticals can afford them. And let me talk about the jobs issue. It's been said that 3 million jobs in Britain depend on our exports to the EU. But the truth is, 5 million of their jobs depend on their exports to us, because they export to us about, in proportion, for every £3 we're exporting, they're exporting 5 to us. Our deficit with them is £62 billion a year. It's a staggering sum. Our trade surplus with the rest of the world, where many of our growing markets is, was £27 billion last year. So we're actually very successful in exporting elsewhere as against imports. We're very successful in exporting to the EU just now, but not as against imports, which is why 1 million German jobs depend on sending goods to us. 800,000 in the car industry, £11 billion worth of German exports to Britain. That's why there'll be no trade war with Germany. And with France, where they're now drinking more whiskey in France than they are champagne. And where their trade with us in wines and champagnes is just under £1 billion a year, 494,000 jobs in France across the sectors dependent on exports to Great Britain. They're hardly going to lead the way for 10% trade tariffs, are they? So all this nonsense about trade wars will only cut off their noses to spite their faces. And that's why I don't think there will be trade wars. In summary, then, if we look at the key areas where we have to divert resources, we've got to take that area of output in Europe, that sector that contributes about 1.6% to our output every year, that employs fewer than 5.5% of the population, but gets 40% of all the grants, and that's agriculture. £43 billion a year. £43 billion is more than 123 countries in the United Nations have as their GDP every year. And for that £43 million, our farmers aren't even allowed to say how it's spent. And because it forces up, by excluding goods coming in from elsewhere, the amount that we have to spend on food by about £7 a week, it is completely bonkers. Now, we've had 54 years of it, and I've heard 54 promises of reform. I don't believe there can be reform. And if you look at the tragedy of fishing in Britain, where in 1972, just before we joined the then EEC, the estimate was that we had 80% of the productive fishing stocks around British waters and the rich North Sea and Atlantic, 80% of the whole of the EU. What's happened since then? We've lost half our jobs in fishing. Our overfishing has been so gross that it's reckoned that 75% of stocks are under threat. 70% of cod stocks have declined by 70% in the last decade, and the fishing is so inefficient that it's led, as Willie Bain, our former fishing opposition spokesman, said, it's led to up to half the catch being dumped overboard and landing up on our beaches. That's the real pollution of the beaches, and it's so inefficient that 60% of everything we need in fish and fish products in the EU has to be imported. It's imported from places like Norway, where in the past 10 years, over 40% increase in production's occurred, or from Iceland, which has a far smaller fishing area than we actually have, but in terms of their fleet as against the British fleet, they're producing twice as many fish. So again, something that we've got to take control of. And look at steel. Our inability collectively in the EU to take action against the Chinese dumping and imports is an absolute scandal. And if I might say as an aside to the Scottish National Party, and I know you'll have a chance to respond to this, I think that at least while David Cameron was making some demands of Europe, I mean very mild and very insubstantial, my criticism of our government here in Scotland, they made no demands whatsoever. And that was a betrayal of Scottish fishing communities, of Scottish farming communities, of Scottish steel and manufacturing. And of course, if we were to go independent, the EU would force us to join the euro, which, to be fair to the SNP, was in their election manifesto when they first stood for the Scottish Parliament. So what we've got, and what I think I hope I've shown you, is a rounded picture of an institution that did have very, very high ideals after the war, of bringing together countries for the benefit of people, but was very quickly hijacked by the big business interests that made sure that business profited from it at the expense of workers and the general public. It is an idea whose time has long gone. I mean, even Switzerland now has trade deals with more countries than the EU has, including China and Japan, which are causing us so much grief. And therefore, I firmly believe that our future is best as a prosperous country outside the EU and embracing the wider world. Thank you.